Major funding for the rise and fall of Jim Crow is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. And by support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Corporate support is made possible by New York Life.
With vision and determination, one generation dreamed of creating a better world for the next. New York Life is proud to bring you remarkable stories of dedication, struggle, and triumph.
In May of 1918, there was a series of lynchings in Georgia. They came to the house of Hayes and Mary Turner and took Hayes Turner because they thought that he was involved in a conspiracy to kill a white plantation owner. They took him off and lynched him. His wife was 9 months pregnant.
And Mary Turner said that if she ever found out who committed these crimes against her husband, she was going to swear out a warrant and have them arrested. The mob went insane at the impudence of an African-American woman daring to challenge them. And they pulled her out of her home and dragged her to a river, strung her up, tortured her, lit her on fire, and she still wasn't dead yet. So a mob member came and cut open her womb, and the baby spilled out. And the baby was alive, and they stomped the baby, and then left Mary Turner and her child to die.
In the land of Jim Crow laws and customs, Mary Turner had done the unthinkable, and to the white supremacist, the intolerable. She had threatened to fight back. The World War had created a new impetus and a new confidence in those writer Alan Locke called the New Negro. Thousands of blacks had migrated north to help build the instruments of war, and thousands of blacks had gone to Europe to fight in it. By the war's end, some 200,000 African Americans would serve their country in Europe in a segregated army. One all-black regiment, the 369th, would fight side by side with French soldiers as equals. In the end, the 369th spent more time fighting on the front lines than any other American unit. The men of the 369th earned an unprecedented number of French military honors, 171, Croix de Guerre, France's highest military medal. African American soldiers hoped that their patriotic service would earn them recognition, acceptance, and equality in American society upon their return.
African-American veterans returning to their towns south of the Mason-Dixon line found themselves set upon and spat upon and indeed brutally accosted.
I saw the black soldier fighting for democracy, to make the world free. And these people came back expecting the blessings of liberty and full deserts of freedom, coming back and being denied it.
There was a whole upsurge of reaction that said, if you think anything has changed because of this war, you've got a second and third thought coming.
But the outspoken black leader W.E.B. Du Bois is urging the returning veterans to fight in a new battle.
Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States, or know the reasons why. This country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It gloats in lynching, disfranchisement, caste, brutality, and insults. By the gods of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if we do not now marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. W.E.B. Du Bois.
On Sunday, July 27, 1919, Eugene Williams, a 16-year-old black youth, crossed the invisible color line on a Chicago lakefront beach. Trying to swim away from attacking whites, he drowned, igniting racial fires. Roving bands of whites beat and killed unsuspecting blacks. Blacks fought back. At the riot's end, 15 whites and 23 blacks were dead. Jim Crow, said the Chicago Tribune, had come north. The Chicago riot had become part of the racial frenzy. Racial clashes, massacres, even lynchings in Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. One organization stood firmly against this onslaught of evil, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the foremost interracial civil rights organization in America. One man was becoming the unlikely hero of the NAACP's battle against racial terrorism. 27-year-old Walter White became the chief investigator of lynchings and massacres.
Walter White's task was to come into the South, and one of the heroic stories, and we don't tell it anymore. Here was a black man who had blue eyes and blonde hair, who risked his life going among the lynchers, passing as a white man, and got the names of many of white men who had been a part of lynch mobs.
At the NAACP, they thought White was risking his life. He knew he was. He wrote to his superiors,
"I understand that this is dangerous. I take full responsibility if anything happens to me, and I hold you not liable in the event of my injury or death. Walter White."
As the summer of 1919 drew to a close, White read a newspaper account claiming that black farmers near the town of Elaine, Arkansas, had incited an armed uprising against the local white community.
I was eager to go to the scene and left for Arkansas on the first train after we had scraped up enough money for the fare. Walter White.
When White arrived, he discovered that black farmers, tired of continually being cheated out of their fair share of the cotton crop, had formed a union to sue their landlords.
They were meeting in a Negro church in Hoopsburg. When a white mob fired on the church, the fire of the attackers was returned and one of the assailants was killed. The match had been applied to the powder keg. Within a few minutes, efficiently directed, heavily armed mobs swept over the countryside, hunting down and killing every Negro they could find. Walter White.
When the killing stopped, some said as many as 200 blacks had been killed. Hundreds were arrested, 12 sentenced to death for killing whites. But even as White was uncovering the evidence which would ultimately free all of the accused, he found himself suddenly in danger.
I was interviewing some whites when a black man told me that my identity had been discovered and a lynching party was prepared for me. I boarded the first train out of Helena. The conductor said, "You're leaving just before the fun is about to start. There's a damn yellow nigger down here passing for white, and the boys are gonna get him. And when they get through with him, he won't pass for white no more. No matter what the distance, I shall never take a train ride as long as that one." Later in Memphis, I learned that news had been circulated there that I had been lynched in Arkansas that afternoon. Walter White.
As Walter White returned to the safety of the North, one of the darkest chapters of Jim Crow was about to be written. In the early 1920s, Tulsa, Oklahoma, was home to one of the most prosperous African-American communities in the country. The Greenwood District was home to some of the greatest black entrepreneurs of the time. Their investments earned it the reputation as Black Wall Street. But the sight of increasing evidence of black competence and confidence was not what the white supremacists of Tulsa wanted to see. They stayed in the shadows like a coiled snake, waiting for the opportunity to strike. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune ran a front-page story entitled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl." The inference, in the language of the day, meant a black man had raped a white woman. Within hours, Tulsa, Oklahoma exploded into possibly the worst race riot in American history. That night, angry mobs of white men roamed the city, setting fires, going door to door, and killing blacks at random. There were reports of drive-by shootings, firebombings, and lynchings. By the next morning, Greenwood lay in ashes. Some 35 city blocks had been burned to the ground. "6,000 blacks had been rounded up by the mob, over 800 wounded. 300 African Americans lay dead. Not a single white was ever prosecuted."
You could not keep a people as committed to justice and growth as African Americans in this country in a subordinate status without the threat of violence. Domestic terrorism was the might behind Jim Crow. It was the might behind racial apartheid. Racial apartheid in this country could not be accomplished simply with ideologies. It was reinforced and sustained by terrorism. It created fear. It intimidated people. It was how racial subordination was sustained.
For many Southerners in the 1920s and 30s, lynching was a family affair. Gordon Parks remembers his first lynching when he was 9.
We lived down here about 10 miles from Gainesville and over in Cummings, about 20 miles. And they had this nigger slave cutting wood. Back then we had wood stoves, wood heat with wood. And they left their daughter there, 17-year-old. And she was took a bath and was dressed and got in front of the picture window. And this nigger man was cutting wood, and he took and broke in and raped her and tore her clothes off of her. And then when the parents come home, she told them. They called my grandpa, he was the Grand Dragon, and my daddy was, he was the wizard, and my daddy was the Grand Dragon. And they got about 100 people and went over there, and we went and got him. And grandpa said I could go with him. We went to the house, and these Klansmen got him. We took him down the road, dirt roads then. It ain't paved, wasn't paved then. Took him down there in this big old oak tree, and there's about 200 down there. And they took and set him down, had his hands tied behind him, and grandpa asked me, told my daddy to let me ask anybody to have anything to say, you know, before they pull him up the tree and hang him. And I asked anybody to have anything to say, and one man said, yeah, I got something to say to him. He opened a big old knife. It had a blade on it that long, I reckon. He took and cut him from ear to ear, and then they put the rope around his neck and pulled him up in the tree. And we stayed there about an hour. They hung him in the trees to be sure he died before they left.
Lynchings in the South had soared to record numbers. In 1919 alone, over 90 African Americans were lynched, and nearly one lynching every 4 days.
This tremendous increase in lynchings after World War I that threatened the ability of the NAACP to be an adequate spokesperson for people of color who were terrorized in many of these communities. And so White and others recognized that lynching had to become more of a priority in the campaign to protect the rights of black people.
Relief from physical terrorism was critical to all of the other rights that people would strive for, the right to vote, the right to protest. I mean, if you risked your very life by doing that, I mean, you're exposed to the possibility of a lynching. That form of terrorism was just brutal for building a movement for civil rights reform in the South.
In the North, in the early 1900s, the anti-lynching crusaders had taken their protests to the streets. In 1922, they would provide major support to the NAACP as the fight against lynching became the NAACP's top priority.
We feel that what we need to do now is to dramatize as highly as possible the whole question of lynching. We have decided to insert in newspapers of wide circulation a full-page advertisement in which we are to put in as startling manner as possible the hell truths about lynching, of which the American public is so woefully ignorant. Walter White.
But while Walter White and the leadership of the NAACP were trying to counteract the complacency of white Americans, one of the founders of the NAACP had a very different idea of how to overcome racial injustice. For W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of his literary magazine, The Crisis, change required the building of a strong, educated African-American community.
Education and work are the levers to uplift the people. Work alone will not do it unless inspired by the right ideals and guided by intelligence. Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. W.E.B. Du Bois.
To Du Bois, no place was better equipped to train black leaders than his alma mater, Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Established in the 1880s by the American Home Mission Society, it had been for many blacks a way out of the cycle of violence and repression of the South. Fisk had given rise to the first generation of the new Negro.
Fisk in the 20s is considered the #1 black college in America. Students all over are trying to get into Fisk. They were committed to a kind of civil and political equality that challenged traditions, challenged slavery, challenged Jim Crow, challenged the black codes, and so forth. And Fisk represented that whole tradition.
But in 1924, the white president of Fisk, Fayette Avery McKenzie, would begin a fundraising campaign that would place these traditions at risk. To raise $1 million, McKenzie turned to Southern and Northern philanthropists.
He invited the foundations into Fisk. He pretty much said to them that we will change our ways. We will stop agitating for civil and political equality. We will stop agitating against Jim Crow, against racism in the South. We'll make our peace with the South.
McKenzie refused to allow a chapter of the NAACP on campus, and the only version of The Crisis that could be found in the university library was censored.
They began to change the Fisk curriculum for the first time. They began to talk about an industrial education program at what was the quintessential liberal arts institution among the black colleges.
In New York, W.E.B. Du Bois, shocked by what he was told, wrote,
"Colored youth must be given a broad vision of truth. My disappointment has continued as charge after charge against Fisk policies reaches me."
For Du Bois, this was a corruption of the ideals and purposes of this institution and the larger objectives of intellectual emancipation of people of color.
As the industrialists became more involved in Fisk University, it was clear that Fisk's most distinguished alumnus was the one person that they didn't like. And so they sort of said to Fisk, separate yourself from Du Bois.
But in 1924, with his daughter graduating from Fisk, Du Bois would get the platform he wanted to make his views known.
Fisk had to invite him back. I mean, he was, without question, their most distinguished alumnus. His daughter was graduating. Everything seemed appropriate. The students wanted him to come back. The alumni wanted him to come back. So they brought him back. They should have known better.
And so Du Bois came, and in that wonderful chapel there at Fisk, Du Bois delivered an address which he called Diuturni Silenti, the Latin of which was borrowed from Cicero's address to the Roman Senate, in which Cicero had said for long years he had been silent, but he would remain silent no longer.
In Fisk today, discipline is choking freedom. Threats are replacing inspiration. Ironclad rules, suspicion, and tale-bearing are almost universal. The Negro race needs colleges. We need them today as never before. But we do not need colleges so much that we can sacrifice the manhood and womanhood of our children to the thoughtlessness of the North or the prejudice of the South. Ultimately, Fisk will and must survive. The spirit of its great founders will renew itself, and it is that spirit, once reborn, that calls us now. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Mackenzie had achieved his goal. Fisk had a $1 million endowment, but Mackenzie had a rebellion on his hands. The students called for a strike.
They said they were going to strike and just leave the university. So a whole bunch of them just walked off. They went back home. And I said, well, I can't follow the crowd. I'm going to see for myself. So I went over to Dr. Mackenzie's home and talked with him about what his views were. He wasn't going to change his views. And I told him I was sorry. I enjoyed his children, enjoyed teaching them at Sunday school, but I was going too. So I left Fisk.
Over half of Fisk's enrolled students walked away rather than live with Mackenzie's autocratic policies. 2 months later, on April 16, 1925, Mackenzie finally resigned. The students returned victorious. The cherished freedoms they had fought for had been restored. In the crisis that spring, W.E.B. Du Bois drew his conclusion.
The fight at Fisk University is a fateful step in the development of the American Negro. It involves the tremendous question as to whether Negro youth shall be trained as Negro parents wish, or as Southern whites and Northern copperheads demand. Let the attention of no Negro be distracted from this main and crucial point. W.E.B. Du Bois.
To Du Bois, the fight at Fisk was a lesson in survival. But survival to be what? To do what?
The North is no paradise, but the South is at best a system of caste and insult, and at worst, a hell. Brothers, come north.
Those who came, like writer Zora Neale Hurston and poet Langston Hughes, were part of what Du Bois called the talented tenth.
The whole point of his talented tenth was that the people who could lead should lead to benefit those who could not take such an activist role.
He said that those who had the opportunity to go to college had an obligation to give back to the community, to become leaders, and to be able to speak in circles where the masses were not going to be afforded an opportunity to participate. So the talented tenth was not for the purpose of snobbery, but for the purpose of service and responsibility.
For black artists like sculptor Augustus Savage, being responsible meant telling the truth, all of it, as they saw it.
They wanted to write about the street. They wanted to write about the funky side of black life. They wanted to write about the real people, quote unquote. And in 1926, Langston Hughes says, "We want to hear the voice of Bessie Smith. We want to hear the moans and groans of the blues. None of this, high-toned stuff. We are proud of our black, dark-skinned selves."
They were musicians, artists, and writers, finding their voice. Many had come from the South in the great migration of talent. Harlem had become the Mecca of the new Negro. A cultural revolution had exploded, breaking through Jim Crow barriers and establishing a black presence in the heart of white America. But the Mecca was more like an oasis. At least that's how it looked from the South, where 80% of black Americans lived, where cotton was king, and sharecropping, surviving on a share of the crop you produced on another man's land, was a way of life for poor blacks and poor whites.
The South was the poorest region in the country. It was dependent on a plantation economy that was totally dependent on cheap labor. The sharecropper, who was really the poorest of the poor, was trapped in a culture of poverty.
The price of cotton on a world market had collapsed in the 1920s. And because of the decline in cotton, the landlord was nickeling and diming everything he can get, which made more difficult the lives of sharecroppers.
The man would take it out the field, take your cotton, and then the man at the store, your head critic, he run the books up on you, so you didn't have nothing. You work a whole year and hand pick 40 bales of cotton and come out with nothing.
You couldn't get out there and argue with him. Well, dude, he's just going to tell you to get out of his house. And then you got to go find you another one that's going to do the same thing to you. Poor white people and black people was pretty much in the same boat. Because all there was to them people is somebody to walk behind a horse.
In their material lives, in what they had to eat, in the kind of work they did, in what they wore, in the houses they lived, white and black tenant farmers and sharecroppers were closer than any other two groups of people you can imagine in America.
We didn't know anything about what you call it, discrimination or whatever. We didn't know anything about anything because we was all like a family. Every time we look out the door, it was a white child coming with a bucket. And we said, Mama, there comes so-and-so with a thank you, ma'am, bucket. And my dad never said don't. And my mama give you a head if she thought she could get it back on her shoulder. Well, Dad was a different person. He didn't let nobody run over him.
Emma Mae's daddy was Ned Cobb, an uneducated black sharecropper who prospered, helped by a literate wife and renowned stamina. He bought new acres of good farmland, mules, even a second automobile.
He loved the land. It was clear how much he loved the work that he did. He was a farmer, no schooling. He happened to spend his life walking behind a mule and a plow, but he had a genius. He had a great mind. He was able to make sense of the things, as he said, things that touched him.
But being a black landowner in Tallapoosa County, Alabama, was dangerous. Black success frightened whites.
They looked hard. They didn't stop looking. They don't like to see a nigger with too much. They don't like it one bit. White people was afraid the money would make the nigger act too much like his own man. Ned Cobb.
In a sense, the white upper classes, white ruling classes, have ruled by dividing white and black working people from each other. Ned was aware of that history, and that history helped fuel his own opposition.
In 1931, Ned Cobb would find a way to express his opposition to the system. The American Communist Party, which had been gaining support from a struggle to achieve better working conditions for Northern workers, had come south.
In the South, the Communist Party was the only political organization that took a stand against segregation and for racial equality and acted on it and embraced the struggle at a very basic level.
In the face of aggressive opposition from the Ku Klux Klan, the party intensified its efforts to recruit Alabama farmers into a union called the Sharecroppers Union. The communists were astonished as 6,000 farmers responded.
Ned associated the Union with, in fact, the Yankees who had come down in the period of Civil War and just after in Reconstruction to free the slaves. And he said that his grandmother had told him that the Yankees had come down and started the job, and somebody would come and finish it. And when he met the organizers of the Sharecroppers Union, he thought, the prophecy is filled, the time has come.
He had joined the union, and he was the president, he was the spokesperson for the union, and he felt that it was his obligation to protect the people in that area.
Several months after joining the union, Ned Cobb took his gun and went to the home of his neighbor Cliff James to confront the sheriff who was enforcing a foreclosure on Cliff James's land.
And Ned says, please go back to the people who instructed you and tell him the situation. He will pay them what he owes them. And the sheriff said, no, we're going to take what he has got this morning. Go in there and get that mule. And Ned said, if you take it, you'll take it over my dead body. And the sheriff says, well, back out, cease, back out, he says. And then the sheriff turns to him and says, you already done said enough for me to be done killed you. And Ned says, You want to kill me? Kill me. There's nothing but the air between us. Nothing but the air. He had on a long coat, and he had kept that gun hidden in his coat. A shot is fired. Shooting begins. And Ned pulls out that Smith & Wesson, and he says, I unloaded it, he said, and it sang to me like a baby. Most of those shots hit the trees. And as Ned steps back into the house, he receives a shotgun load of buckshot in his backside.
And my dad had on a pair of brand new overalls. And it wasn't a place on his overalls that my mother could patch. It was just, you know, they're white inside and blue on the outside. And they were just shot up. But my daddy was hopping. They tell me, my daddy said, well, pour it in me.
Ned was taken to jail, where he languished for several months until he was brought to trial for attempted murder. Now, the sheriffs had tried to murder him, but in fact, he and other members of the Union were charged with attempted murder. And Ned was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary.
My grandfather was courageous. He was courageous, and all he was trying to do was make life better for everyone. Not only his family, not only his brothers and his sisters, and for his wife and his children, but he wanted to see life better for everyone, whether they were white or black. And if he had to spend the 12 years in jail, he would say, so be it, I'll do it, for it to be a difference.
Making life better for African Americans in the early 1930s was a formidable task. As Langston Hughes said, the Depression had knocked everyone down a peg or two, and Negroes had but a few pegs to fall. The NAACP, like the rest of America, was struggling to survive.
People want to see results, and they want to feel that what they're doing is going to lead to something. And I think it was very hard for the NAACP to provide that. There was no political leverage. You know, black people in the South couldn't vote. There's not any movement forward on the main issues, anti-lynching legislation, sharecroppers getting fair prices for their labor. Things aren't changing.
In 1932, Walter White takes over the leadership of the NAACP as its general secretary.
Walter White was so deeply committed and immersed in this organization that I don't think he would let himself consider whether they were failing or not. The point was to keep moving.
Walter White was, he was able to keep the organization together when many people were thinking about quitting. Du Bois talked about disbanding the NAACP and getting it started on a new basis. There was a fair amount of distrust for Walter White from many people on the NAACP staff. Du Bois, chief among them. Walter White was a sort of administrator who liked to keep his fingers on everything, including the crisis, which he believed was not reflecting the work of the NAACP so much as reflecting the beliefs and opinions of W.E.B. Du Bois. This was Du Bois's vehicle for making known his views. It broadcast a variety of opinions on important questions of the day, such as what should the Negro's attitude be toward Marxism. Walter White was not so much concerned about many of these theoretical questions as he was concerned with making sure that the crisis covered what the NAACP was doing. In 1931, he made a play to get control of the crisis, which was something that Du Bois was aghast at.
They look at each other and begin to say things about each other in a shockingly sharp way, so that Du Bois attacks White as being really a white man masquerading as a Negro, to use the term of the day. And White, of course, is able to give as good as he gets and charge Du Bois with being an egomaniac and an intellectual who doesn't see the needs of the times.
For the great, great majority of Americans, the single overriding fact is the Great Depression and the need to combat that depression, the need to get the American economy rolling again. Everything else was secondary.
In 1933, a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected. He had promised a New Deal for everyone. But to get the economy rolling, he would need the support of Southern senators. Programs to advance racial equality would have to wait. But for W.E.B. Du Bois, waiting was not an option.
Du Bois came up with a proposal that since the New Deal wasn't going to solve the problem of the African American should do it, him and herself, within the context of the racial segregation that in any case was not going to go away, whatever the New Deal did. And to sell that point, Du Bois did what he so often did. He made it so controversial that you would have to address it by writing 3 editorials using the word segregation and separation. And these were red flags to the NAACP and its many followers. The whole point was racial integration.
He sort of came out in favor of separate schools in the article, which was very, very much against the tradition of NAACP.
But Du Bois knew that everybody would stop and pause and say, what's going on? But in fact, they stopped and they were so shaken that they didn't find out really what was going on. This would have been like Du Bois writing an editorial using the word nigger.
I know that this article will forthwith be interpreted by certain illiterate nitwits as a plea for segregated Negro schools. It is not. It is saying in plain English that a separate Negro school where children are treated like human beings, trained by teachers of their own race who know what it means to be black, is infinitely better than making our boys and girls doormats to be spit and tramped upon and lied to by ignorant social climbers whose sole claim to superiority is the ability to kick niggers when they are down. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Du Bois was being pragmatic. Do you accept the separate equality? The Supreme Court isn't going to do anything about it. He thought for 50 years.
What Du Bois was trying to say in that article was that, look, integration is important, but there's something more important than integration, and that is the education of African American children and their welfare. See, the thing to remember here is Du Bois believed that African American teachers were quite capable of teaching African American kids. The resources weren't there, but the teachers were there.
My first grade teacher in a wooden frame school, believe it or not, used to have all the black kids in the first grade. She'd tell us what we wore on Wednesday, and by Friday we were supposed to walk out before the class, always with our chest out and our shoulders up, and say, I'm Frederick Douglass, and I did this, I did this, I did that. My name is W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is what I did. I graduated from Fisk University. I went to Harvard, and I wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk. We couldn't even read, but we were doing this. My name is Sojourner Truth, little girl. My name is Ida B. Wells, and you go right on down the line.
Du Bois felt that self-segregation was something that was all right, and black institutions were important, indeed critical for building strength within black communities. And he articulated this in the pages of the crisis, and Walter White and a number of the board members just wouldn't tolerate it.
Southern congressmen began to quote Du Bois in the congressional record because they were saying, indeed, we should have a code of relief for whites and a code of relief for blacks. So the association, Walter White now running it, said, quiet, shut up, they're quoting you, the outstanding civil libertarian in the congressional record. Bilbo says you're great. And Du Bois says, doesn't matter. This is an issue.
White was an organization man. He loved the NAACP. It was his church. He was going to run it, and Du Bois was going to follow in line. And of course, Du Bois wasn't going to follow in line. There could be no equivocation on this. And so Du Bois ultimately resigned in 1934. I think in part he may have felt that the NAACP had been spent, that it didn't have the flexibility, that white was too limiting and narrow in his vision.
In the August 1934 issue of The Crisis, Du Bois explains he needed to criticize the NAACP, and the board wouldn't let him. He was leaving not because change couldn't come, but because, he said, personally, I can do nothing more. But there was much left to be done if Black America was to enjoy the benefits guaranteed to all Americans by the Constitution. One man, Charles Hamilton Houston, believed that not only could the NAACP do more, it had to take the lead. In 1935, he left his job as the dean of the prestigious law school at Howard University to become the NAACP's first full-time salaried legal counsel in 20 years.
Charles Hamilton Houston went to South Carolina with a movie camera and would film county by county the black school and the white school. And it was just this visual essay in inequality, but inequality doesn't even describe it. I mean, just the awful conditions that young black children went to school under. I mean, they had schoolhouses where there were cracks in the wall, they were crowded together on benches. And then the white school in the same county would be a brick structure, 2 stories, basketball court. I mean, it was just so clearly unequal. And he would use that to show in the North, to kind of get support for the campaign and really put a face on what segregation meant.
There were still people, even the NAACP, who thought that black people simply had to improve their own worlds and to make them sort of somehow better and more sustainable. Houston said it won't work that way. We have to basically integrate ourselves into all of the public goods and public resources that are around us, and until we do that, we're going to always be considered inferior.
Discrimination in education is symbolic of all the more drastic discriminations which Negroes suffer in American life. And these apparent senseless discriminations in education against Negroes have a very definite objective on the part of the ruling whites: to curb the young blacks and prepare them to accept an inferior position in American life without protest or struggle. The discriminations practiced against the Negro are no accident. Charles Houston.
Houston was convinced that the battle for civil rights had to be won in the schools, but would have to be fought in the courts. But while Houston would look to the courts, White was looking to the president.
Roosevelt himself is not thinking African Americans when he comes in, but what he is thinking is we need a program that embraces all Americans. We need to provide relief for people. And that sort of inclusive, democratic spirit, African Americans interpret that as that includes us.
A third of all African American families were directly assisted by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. And as numerous blacks made the point at the time, this gave them hope. This made them, for the first time, really feel included.
But with all the gains in housing, jobs, and public facilities, one condition remained unchanged. Segregation was still the rule, not the exception. And in the South, lynchings continued unabated. In the North, the NAACP anti-lynching campaign gained new momentum with a new argument. In a widely circulated brochure, the NAACP reminded the nation of the potential damage to all of its children. Do not look at the Negro. Look at the white children, it said. What havoc is being wrought in their minds? For 20 years, the NAACP had been crusading against lynching. Now, after years of lobbying, protests, and marching, support for a federal law slowly gained momentum. By 1938, 70% of Americans expressed support for an anti-lynching bill. For Walter White, it was time to increase pressure on Congress.
The same arguments that were made by Southern Dixiecrats and senators then are the same arguments you hear now. No, this is going to empower the federal government. It's got to be states' rights. You're taking away the autonomy of the states. The 11th Amendment, states and individuals have to be protected from this kind of federal intrusion. Don't take away our states' rights.
Walter White, not having any luck with senators on the fence, goes to Eleanor Roosevelt and says, you got to help me here. You got to get the president to speak out on this. But I think that Walter really confused being near people with power with having access to power himself. And ultimately, he was disappointed time and again when Franklin Roosevelt wouldn't come through with his promises. When Eleanor Roosevelt, who was extraordinarily influential, couldn't deliver.
The president was frankly unwilling to challenge the Southern leadership. I did not choose the tools with which I must work, he told me. If I come out for the anti-lynching bill, they will block every bill I ask Congress to pass. I just can't take that risk. Walter White.
When the federal anti-lynching bill is put before Congress in 1938, it is filibustered to death.
Walter White would have continued to fight for an anti-lynching law in perpetuity, but for Charles Houston's arguments that the law is never going to pass, don't be so focused on this particular campaign, look at how the NAACP could grow in other areas.
Charles Houston wanted to emphasize to Walter White that there was already civil rights legislation and law available. Officers of the law were not supposed to subject persons to loss of life or deprivation of rights. It is a matter of the lives of African Americans being valued.
Houston knew that the Constitution, properly understood and rightly applied, would give Black Americans the freedom they were fighting for. So he took the fight to the courts.
My grandfather saw the courts as the ideal way to achieve equality, because if you fought that fight and you won, well, then it would be a legitimate victory, and it would be one that would be recognized by everyone, and would have the weight of authority behind it.
Their hope was to build towards some Supreme Court decisions that would begin to turn the tide and open the way towards challenging segregation in education. And so he had a strategy.
Charles Houston, having his training from Harvard Law School, understood that judges are not going to make decisions that will overturn rulings having to do with constitutional interpretation unless absolutely necessary. So it was Charles Houston who became the strategist and the architect for a campaign that would gradually dismantle the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 separate but equal doctrine.
So they began to carefully pick cases that they would litigate, pick cases to win.
And cases that would establish precedent. Cases that, in Charles Houston's words, would make plain the inequality that existed in the educational opportunities of blacks and whites, and would make true equality too expensive for states to maintain. In 1936, Houston and his legal team would find a case with all the right components. Lloyd Gaines, a college graduate, had been denied entrance to the law school at the University of Missouri because of his race. Houston argued that Missouri was obligated to either build a law school for blacks equal to that of whites, or admit him to the University of Missouri.
Gaines became the first time when the United States Supreme Court was asked expressly, does a state have an obligation to provide professional education to people of color if there is no professional education available within that state? And the court said yes, and they ordered the University of Missouri to allow Lloyd Gaines to be admitted, and it was incredibly influential.
The Gaines case laid the groundwork for Houston's master plan. It would become the basis for the legal battles that would one day bring an end to legalized Jim Crow in America. But this one victory would not be enough for Charles Hamilton Houston. Over the years to come, Houston would pursue cases at every level, fighting against segregation in all aspects of American society.
He saw himself as a soldier who needed to work 20 hours a day, and he did so very, very often.
My grandfather had no tolerance for slackers or laziness or excuses. He believed in getting it done no matter the personal cost.
I think my father saw himself as a soldier, as a fighter in a long campaign against injustice. He did not stint in his hours or in his travel or in his legal preparation, despite the fact that his health was declining.
After suffering 2 heart attacks, on April 22nd, 1950, Charles Hamilton Houston died.
My father, on his deathbed in the hospital, was given a book written by the attorney Louis Nizer entitled Peace of Mind, and that in the margin of one of the pages of that book, he inscribed to me the message, tell Bois, which was my pet name as a boy, that I did not run out on him, but that in every fight, some fall.
He died in 1950, so he wasn't around when the historic victories came to light. He wasn't visible during the civil rights movement, even during Brown, and because of that, he was, in too many quarters, largely forgotten. But make no mistake, he is the architect. He transformed the legal culture within this country. That kind of courage is essentially what transformed this country. Unless there were a handful of black folks who, after being beat down, were willing to stand up and say, my head is bloodied but not bowed, it would not be possible to imagine change.
Amid the terror of mob violence, the tragedies of inferior schools, and exploitive bosses, amidst every attempt to impose white supremacy and suppress black advancement, there were triumphs, seen and unseen. Du Bois had demonstrated the power of black leadership. Walter White had challenged America to confront its shame. Charles Hamilton Houston had convinced the courts to uphold the law. They and hundreds of others, black and white, men and women, were planting in churches and colleges and the halls of government the seeds of a more assertive battle for racial justice. But while there was cause for celebration, Charles Houston sounded a cautionary note.
So far, so good. But the fight has just begun. Maybe the next generation will be able to take time out to rest. But we have too far to go and too much work to do. Shout if you want, but don't shout too soon.
The tragic era of Jim Crow comes to life at PBS Online with interactive activities and first-hand accounts. Find details on key people, events, and more at pbs.org. Major funding for the rise and fall of Jim Crow is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. And by support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Corporate support is made possible by New York Life.
Today should be better than yesterday. Tomorrow should be even greater. This idea inspired a movement, and New York Life salutes the vision and bravery of those who improved our nation and our world.